Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I'd like to pay tribute to an amazing woman whose life we celebrated recently in Townsville, Dr Evelyn Scott. A state funeral was held for Dr Scott, and I was able to attend the service along with my colleague Senator Pat Dodson, Warren Snowden, the member for Lingiari, and Cathy O'Toole, the member for Herbert, who was very instrumental in supporting the family to make sure that such an amazing woman was farewelled in a wonderful way. Dr Evelyn Scott certainly inspired women across the country, but First Nations people. Her story is really one of humble beginnings. Her grandfather was from Vanuatu and enslaved, brought across here to work in the sugarcane fields. And she grew up in Townsville and had an incredibly deep sense of human rights and social justice. She was certainly a warrior for her people, an incredible champion for reconciliation here in this country, and fearless in every sense of the word. Very, very tall woman whose presence was so commanding, and I remember on so many occasions having the pleasure to meet with her, laugh with her, and to learn from her, really. At the state funeral, we heard from a number of people who gave tremendous reflections on Dr Scott's life. In particular, her very close friend, Pat Turner, the CEO of Night Show, who remembered her, and she said that, you know, Dr Scott's presence was commanding, as was her contribution. I think one of the things that really stood out to me, and has no doubt stood out to many others who attended the state funeral, is hearing the early days of Dr Scott's life and the strength in which her own family persevered and navigated a way of life in far north Queensland, and the combination of her Vanuatu heritage and her Aboriginal heritage. Her father instilled in her incredible values with the saying of, if you don't think something is right, challenge it. If you don't think something is right, challenge it. And Dr Scott lived with that and challenged things all the way through. One of her early areas that she stepped into was really the push for the 1967 referendum. I mean, her friends and her supporters were people like Eddie Mabo, Faith Bandler, Joe McGuinness, and they're just a few of the stalwarts of First Nations people in terms of the lead-up to the 1967 referendum, the most successful referendum this country's had. And Dr Scott was there at the forefront of all of that and worked behind the scenes to encourage Australians to look at the injustices in our country and to vote yes for First Nations people in this country. She then went on to become the first ever General Secretary of the Indigenous Controlled Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, or for CATSI, in 1973. An incredible feat. Not only to be the General Secretary of this organisation which gave so much hope to First Nations people across the country, but to be a woman in this organisation and to stand strong and inspire other young women. In particular, her 4 daughters, amazing women themselves, and her son. Dr Scott has left 5 children and 7 grandchildren, all of whom would have felt incredibly proud of the tributes that were given to such a inspiring and very graceful woman, and that's something that I recall in my meetings with her. One of the things the Senate may recall is the walk across the bridge for reconciliation. Remember when thousands and thousands of people walked across the bridge on Sydney Harbour, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and the person who inspired that walk was Dr Evelyn Scott. And to this day, I think that when we consider even the images of Australians walking together again to bring unity, to bring compassion, to remind people that we have to find a way within all our differences to walk together. And Dr. Evelyn Scott not only talked about it, she walked about it. And that walk reflected exactly that. And I just think it's something we can always be very proud of, and we must never forget that. And I just want to personally say, from the people of the Northern Territory, and in particular from my families in the Gulf region, the Yanyuwa, Garwa, Mara and Gurangi peoples, I just want to thank Dr. Evelyn Scott for her contribution to our country, and her contribution in particular to bringing all Australians together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his words. Today we honour a proud warrior for her people, a dauntless champion for reconciliation, a fearless truth-teller for our nation. Her dear friend Pat Turner remembered her saying, "Her presence was commanding, as were her contribution." In her iconic black hat, Evelyn Scott stood tall, and by her deeds and her courage, she helped others walk tall. Evelyn's grandfather came to Australia in chains from Vanuatu, put to work cutting cane in North Queensland. As a young woman growing up in Townsville, Evelyn was witness to the invisible chains of discrimination, where Aboriginal people were classified as minors, denied basic rights to housing, to land, to employment and to education. And so she took to heart her father's credo: if you don't think something is right, challenge it. She challenged it, she changed it. At her state funeral, the first one to be ever held for an Aboriginal woman in the state of Queensland, friends remembered a matriarch who set the family table, describing it like a five-star hotel, no snatch and grab breakfast. But they remembered a person also with a consuming passion for justice. Jennifer Dar spoke fondly of how, when Eve was getting ready for an argument, you knew it was coming. Those big brown eyes would be big like saucers, her mouth was tight. Her left hand would take its position firmly on her hip, and then you had two choices available to you: watch out or take cover. The fireworks were about to start. Evelyn's fireworks have illuminated our nation for many decades, at the forefront of the decade-long struggle to achieve the 1967 referendum. As the head of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, and as the chairwoman for the Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation between 1997 and 2000. Mr Speaker, the late 90s were hard years for the cause. The optimism sparked by the Mabo decision and Paul Keating's leadership on native title had faded, and allegations of political correctness, the guilt industry and black armband history dogged the reconciliation conversation. Yet in hindsight, those times were perfectly suited for Evelyn's grace and her tremendous capacity to motivate and to unify. There was no more powerful expression of her leadership than when 250,000 Australians walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of reconciliation. That walk, supported by marches all around the nation, proved that reconciliation was not a fringe issue or a niche issue. It was a people's movement, a national priority central to Australians' understanding of our future and our faith in a more equal future. Mr Speaker, Evelyn Scott lived every metre of the hard road to reconciliation, every setback, every detour, every obstacle put in her path. But yet her faith, her optimism, her belief in the better angels of Australia's nature never wavered. It is fitting we close with her words. In true reconciliation, through the remembering, the grieving and the healing, we can come to terms with our conscience and we can become as one in the dreaming of this land. What a rich and valuable heritage to leave our children, a 56,000-year culture thriving in a country at peace with its conscience. Will you take our hand, she said. Will you dare to share our dream, she said. Evelyn Scott dedicated her life to the pursuit of that dream. So today, as we offer our condolences to her loved ones. We thank them for lending her to the service of this nation for so long. Let us commemorate her life in the most fitting way possible, by redoubling and renewing our efforts to achieve true and lasting reconciliation.
The